Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews on the Strip in Las Vegas, the site of perhaps the most vital hardball 10 U.S. Senate race this year. For the Democrats to take back the U.S. Senate, they've got to win this state. A lot more on that coming up, including an interview with the Democratic candidate out to win the seat. We begin with the breaking news tonight. Federal authorities have made an arrest in the case of those mail bombs sent out to prominent critics of President Trump. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the charges against Cesar Sayoc earlier today.
He has been charged today with 5 federal crimes, including interstate transportation of an explosive, illegal mailing of explosives, threats against former presidents and certain other persons, threatening interstate communications, and assaulting current and former federal officers. For these charges, the defendant faces up to 58 years in prison.
Sayoc is set to make his first court appearance in Miami on Monday. Law enforcement officials say that he has denied the charges. Federal authorities seized a white van covered in pro-Trump and pro-Republican messages earlier in the day. A closer look at that van shows stickers that say CNN sucks and a decal with Hillary Clinton's face with a target over it. Meanwhile, 4 more devices were discovered today, making a total of 14 packages mailed in all. The latest devices were addressed to Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, Senator Kamala Harris of California, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, and Democratic fundraiser Tom Steyer. Prior to the arrest, President Trump weighed in on the bomb scare via Twitter at 3 o'clock in the morning. Later, he retweeted, "Republicans are doing so well in early voting and at the polls, and now this bomb stuff happens, and the momentum greatly slows. News not taking politics, not talking politics. Very unfortunate. What is going on? Republicans, go out and vote." Well, Trump put the word bomb in quotation marks, which might have been a nod to some of his supporters who have argued the bomb scare was a hoax. FBI Director Christopher Wray addressed that allegation directly today. Let's watch him.
We can confirm that 13 IEDs were sent to various individuals across the country. Though we're still analyzing the devices in our laboratory, these are not hoax devices.
On his way to a campaign event today, President Trump again said he lamented the coverage of the bombs.
No, I don't think so. I think that we're running a great campaign. People love what we're doing. They love what we're saying. The Republicans had tremendous momentum. And then, of course, this happened where all that you people talked about was that. And rightfully so. It was a big thing, rightfully so. But now we have to start the momentum again.
He was also asked the president if he had reached out to President Obama or any of the other targets of the bombs. Listen to what he had to say on that.
If they wanted me to, but I think we'll probably pass.
Well, for more, I'm joined right now by Nevada Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. She's with me, Glenn Kirshner, former federal prosecutor, and Nick Rasmussen, NBC News national security and intelligence analyst, and also a former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Senator, thank you. What do you make of this? Take a shot at this. The president of the United States calls it this bomb stuff and says basically it's interfering with his campaign message.
Well, first of all, it's outrageous. Let me just say this. As the Attorney General here, the great state that you are in right now, I work with the FBI. I work with local law enforcement and state and federal law enforcement. They did an incredible job. Postal workers have done an incredible job to protect this country and do it every single day. So I want to make sure we do a shout out to them and thank them for everything that they've done. And this just shows you words matter. The political rhetoric in this country has gotten out of hand, and words matter, and it starts with the person who is sitting in the White House right now. We need to tone it down. We need to work together. It is not okay, and I condemn it, that we take any type of action and harm others because we disagree with them. That's outrageous, Chris.
Are you surprised the president hasn't toned it down?
Well, I was encouraged when he first came out. And so I am concerned. I think many others are. It is time for our country to be united. we are being torn apart. We have seen right now that the rhetoric and the political rhetoric in this country needs to be condemned by everyone. And I go back to what we learned when we were younger. Words matter, and our kids are watching, and people are paying attention to what is happening in this country right now.
Glenn Kirshner, start on the way you look at this race. I've always been impressed by the FBI in cases like bank robberies, anything that involves a national hunt. They seem to have really been on the job in finding this guy. How did they find him so fast, this guy down in Florida?
Yeah, Chris, the FBI, the ATF, the Postal Service Police, they really do remarkable work these days in sort of teasing out every bit of evidence from this kind of scenario. And when you have DNA evidence that is likely going to be found on envelopes, it will be found on the seal of the envelope if the bad guy licked the envelope to seal it. They can actually run forensic tests on the pre-printed labels of Debbie Wasserman Schultz's return address, for example. They found, these misspellings that are not a coincidence between what was on the envelopes and what was apparently in the social media of SIOC. They really did this at light speed. It certainly helped that SIOC's DNA apparently was in a DNA database down in Florida, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is featured prominently in the charging document. So it was the DNA match. It was at least a partial fingerprint match. And I suspect we've only sort of seen the tip of the iceberg of the evidence that's going to connect SIOC to these horrific sort of bombing episodes.
Well, 2 hours before attending another campaign rally in North Carolina tonight, President Trump was asked if he should tone down his rhetoric. Here's what he said.
Well, I think I've been toned down. You want to know the truth. I could really tone it up because, as you know, the media has been extremely unfair to me and to the Republican Party. I think the media has been very, very unfair in terms of the Republican Party and the way it's been covered.
Well, Nick, let's get back to the reality here for a second. The president's really not talking reality there, I don't think, because everybody knows his rhetoric, unfortunately, is in sync with everything on the plastered on that van of that suspect. But why do you think this suspect performed? I mean, he's driving around in a van, advertising his extreme politics with all the targets that the bombs were set for on the side of his truck. It wasn't like he was hiding. What do you make of a character like this?
Well, I think, Chris, one of the key takeaways from the Justice Department press conference earlier today when Chris Wray, the FBI director, was speaking, is that we are still very much in the early stages of an investigation, and there's still a lot to be learned about this individual, Cesar Sayoc's mindset, what exactly was motivating him, whether there was any collaboration or cooperation or enabling performed by other individuals. So I think we'll know more in coming days about what exactly this individual was thinking, intending, or trying to do. But obviously, as you point out, this person was also advertising what their political views were. And certainly in the current toxic political climate that we're living in, it's not a stretch for an individual to take the heated political rhetoric and turn it into something that may actually lead to violence. And I think that's what we've seen here.
Let's go back to the president. I've been through a lot in this life. When Kennedy was killed, when Jack was killed, when Bobby was killed, when Dr. King was killed, there was a national silence like there was after 9/11. People pulled back, and they just felt the need for some kind of reverence for the lesson we learned. You can't go too far in your politics. I don't see the president pulling back.
No, not at all. And I think you're absolutely right. It is okay to disagree with somebody, but that doesn't mean that turns into some sort of political discourse that should tear this country apart or engage somebody to go out and harm someone. You know, our tradition has been political discourse, or we debate it, right? We disagree with somebody, we debate it, or we go to the ballot box and we vote them out of office, or we vote them into office. But at the end of the day, it is toning down that political rhetoric. And yes, we can disagree, but that doesn't mean we dislike or want to harm one another.
The president knows how to turn the heat. He's turned it on this so-called caravan, he calls it, these migrants coming up from Central America. They're not the usual person coming up here from Mexico, for example, out of economic need. These people have political cases to make. What do you make of his constant focus on it? Because he believes it's his baby.
Well,
politically.
Well, and you just said it, Chris. It's his dog whistle to his base. It's to try to motivate his base to come out and vote. But you talked about it. These people are people that are leaving their country, their home, because of poverty or crime or gangs, and they're making a decision to trek miles upon miles. These are mothers, they're children, and they're coming here because for a better life. And so that's, to me, that's where this starts. And then we have in this country laws to decide whether or not they can stay here or whether or not they should be deported at the end of the day. But we have asylum laws that I respect and we should all be respecting. But these aren't terrorists. These aren't people that are coming to this country to harm anyone.
I think they're like my grandparents who came here for the same exact reason.
Well, and
economic opportunity.
Came from Mexico for the
and in a society that's more democratic than where they're coming from. Anyway, former President Barack Obama, target of one of the bombs, as we all know, was in Wisconsin today for a campaign event. And he took a veiled shot at Republicans for their newfound interest in civility. Let's listen to the former president.
I'm hoping you think it's wrong to hear people spend years, months, vilifying people, questioning their patriotism, calling them enemies of the people. And then suddenly you're concerned about civility. Please. And by the way, we don't need more mealy-mouthed elected officials who claim they're disappointed by this bad behavior, but then don't do anything about it.
Well, his Vice President Joe Biden also has been a target, of course, of this bombing stuff, as the president calls it. Here's what Joe Biden said.
I hope and pray that our leaders are going to work to lower the temperature.
Well, let me go back to Glenn, and then I want to go to Nick. You're the experts. What role can you objectively say public discourse plays in arousing people who may have mental problems, they may have whatever psychological conditions that takes their politics into a violent area? Your first, Glenn.
Yeah, Chris, one of the most difficult things for prosecutors to prove in a criminal case is motive, because motive actually requires that we look into the mind of the perpetrator to try to determine what is it that motivated him to commit a crime. I have to tell you, in this case, the motive screams from the stickers that are on this man's van that he is a political, ideological extremist. And you just have to look at the pictures of targets over the face of Hillary Clinton, for example. And I think anybody would be hard-pressed to suggest that the rhetoric coming from the president that incites people to violence, whether it's urging him to punch a protester and he'll pay the legal fees of the offender, or conjuring up the Second Amendment and what might be done to Hillary Clinton if things don't fall his way. I don't know how anybody can say that that kind of overheated rhetoric doesn't incite and inspire what we just saw Sayoc do here.
Senator, one thing that strikes me, you live in a political world, you're an elected official from Nevada. I talk and think about it all the time. This person, this suspect, based upon the names on his target list, based on the faces on that he's targeted on his van, was up to the minute on politics. He knows Tom Steyer has been involved. He knows it's Soros. He knows the most sophisticated stuff. He knows Kamala may run for president. You know, your colleagues, Kamala Harris. He knows Cory Booker may run for president. They're the ones who are most vocal in the Kavanaugh hearings. He watches cable or something every minute of his life. He knows the whole shebang. I don't think you can deny that he's politically inspired in what he did. What do you make of it?
Well, I think you're right. And just look at the targets. And from my perspective, I think from everybody else, the concern is those people that he targeted are the very people that have stood up to this administration and called this administration out, rightfully so, when they needed to. And I think that's the challenge we have now. And I've seen it in Washington. I've been there 2 years now. It is time for us to start coming together, to work together, to solve the problems for this country, not to attack one another. If we disagree, it doesn't mean I dislike you or I want you to be harmed or I'm going to call you a name or bully you. That's got to stop. And I think that's the discourse that I see in Washington right now. That's what everybody is seeing. That's why when I come home to my state, people are frustrated about what is going on there. It is time to work together, and it's time to solve the problems and still be respectful with one another.
Well, it's an honor to meet you out here. Thank you to be in your terrain. Everybody here is having a good time. This is a happy city and a state. Thank you, Senator Kathleen Cortez Masto.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.